What is the fourth dimension, and how does it relate to non-duality? I'm Russ Rapp, bringing you new ways of seeing non-duality. So let's talk about the fourth dimension. There's a lot of YouTube videos that really focus on what the fourth dimension is, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it before relating it to non-duality. So let's start with the zero dimension, which is represented by this little point. So it has no dimensions whatsoever. If you take that to the first dimension, you get a line. So you can think of that as a lot of points. There you go. You can see that line. That's the first dimension. Second dimension, you add the height and the width together, you get a square with a flat surface. Let's see if you can see that. Okay, there's my square I drew. So this is all pretty basic stuff, not groundbreaking here. Third dimension, you get a cube. So what is the fourth dimension? The fourth dimension they call a tesseract or a hypercube, and I drew one. It's a fairly decent picture. It looks like that. So it almost looks like a cube within a cube. And so that's what is considered the fourth dimension, and kind of how a lot of the YouTube videos that I've watched explain the different dimensions. They use kind of the idea of a character in each dimension. And so if someone was in the first dimension, all they could see is what's on the line. So you got the line here. So all that person can see, if they're a little figure on that line, is one direction either way. And when you get the two dimensions here, when you get a square, that's a little easier to explain, because that's almost like, you know, a television screen, or like if you're playing video games, like a character where there's no depth, there's no height, so it's all a two-dimensional figure where you've got height and length, but no dimensions this way. And so as someone who's in the third dimension, I can see everything that's going on in the second dimension. They can't see what I'm doing. And when you take an object like this, that's a third dimensional, you can see the different shadows, so you can see that it's third dimension ping pong. If I were to insert that through the second dimension here, all that character on the screen here that's flat would see, they wouldn't be able to see that whole sphere. They would only see a circle of it and the edges, and they would deduce that it's a round shape. And as you pass it through, it gets smaller to bigger when it's halfway through, and then as you get down to the end, then it's smaller again. So what the person on the inside, they would see a line because it's flat, but they could tell if they walked around in this square here, they could tell that it was a round shape, and it would just get smaller to bigger and then back to smaller as it passed through. And so when you think about the third dimension, so what would a fourth dimension object or being passing through our spatial three dimensions with height, length, height, width, those three dimensions, what would that look through in the fourth dimension? Essentially how it gets explained in YouTube videos is that just imagine a third dimensional object showing up in this room here. It would show up as a fourth dimensional object that was passing through the third dimension. It would be small, it would be a small sphere. It would grow bigger as it passed through to this halfway through, and then as it passed through again, it would get smaller until it disappeared again. So that's how a fourth dimensional being would appear in our space and time here. And so when I watch these videos, what I feel like it's lacking is it has any real direct correlation to the reality that we experience on an everyday basis. It really has no meaning, because I don't know the last time you saw some sort of object or shape manifest and disappear, but it doesn't happen very often in my world. And so it's one of those things where when you talk about 2 dimensions versus 3 dimensions, they talk about how the third dimension can be seen as a lot of flat 2-dimensional planes, if you will, stacked on top of each other, which in this case, you can see you add that extra dimension, so you get this stack of paper here. So this becomes 3-dimensional because you got these sides and then that third side. But what does that mean for us that's living in a 3rd-dimensional world? Does that mean that we're going through a bunch of 2-dimensional worlds of video game characters? To me, that doesn't really make any sense or have any relevance. And so, if we're not really interacting with a 4th-dimensional being or object, or we're not constantly walking through video games, then it really doesn't have a lot of connection other than it's kind of a cool thing to think about with math and that sort of idea. So I'm taking that idea and kind of relating it to something that makes a little bit more sense for me. So when you think about this as a 0 dimension, to me that represents consciousness or awareness, or a point of non-spatial. It's just there. And so if you think of that in the context of the 3D world, we're all a lot of 0 points, if you will, but we'll get to that in a second. When I think of the 1st dimension, the line, I think of that in the sense that as it relates to time. So we're on a timeline. We move forward through time, but there's past, there's future, and there's present. And as we're on that line, as we move throughout that line, we're really stuck in that point where, if you think of it as a lot of dots lined up together, we can't really see far ahead of us. All we can really see is the moment that we're in on that line. The only time we can start imagining a future and a past is in the 3D sense, when we think about visualization, that sort of thing. But when it comes to direct experience of time, there only is the now, this moment. And so there really isn't a past and a future. So essentially we're on a line. And when you think of some of the people that talk about physics and string theory, it's all, and I'm not pretending to be an expert on quantum mechanics, but string theory is a lot of lines intertwined. So in a sense, you're still on a timeline, meaning that you're stuck going in one direction, in that sort of thing. There's also theories about different timelines and constantly splitting, but that's where it gets a little confusing. And when it comes to the 2nd dimension, the square, how I relate to it is, imagine yourself, a lot of times it's easy to think of yourself in the head because we have the visual cortex. We see ourselves as a point, as a consciousness, as a being, as an entity, an identity, personality, ego, whatever you want to call it. We identify as a space. This is me. And so that point of awareness, that consciousness that we identify as ourselves, when we look out into the 3D world, we see it in a 2-dimensional way, meaning light waves come in, or you can picture awareness going out however you want to in all directions. And so it's hitting objects, it's hitting the candles, it's hitting the bookshelf, and it's bringing it back to my awareness, but I can't see behind the bookshelf. You can't see how many fingers, unless maybe you see it in the reflection, holding up to, behind my head. So I'm only seeing those planes in front of me. So it's almost like, I see this sheet as I look around the room. All I'm seeing is a lot of 2-dimensional things that my mind interprets as a 3D world through different ways the brain functions, and just being spatially part of the 3D world. And so as humans, we typically think of screens that we see in front of ourselves because that's what we relate to, because our eyes point forward. Whereas if we were a bug or an owl or something that can see a bigger frame of reference around our head, let's say, then it would essentially be a lot of flat planes in all directions that we would see and be aware of at once, but it's still from that one local point of view. And so when you think of the cube, essentially that's where the world we live in, And that's kind of the sensation. That's how we interact. Those are the fields of atoms and electrons interacting with each other, vibration, all the different forces, gravity, electromagnetism, that we think of as reality. And so, like I said, the zero dimension is kind of a non-spatial consciousness. The first dimension would be considered the timeline, because really nothing really exists without that movement, that animation. And so the first step of consciousness manifesting is time itself, because even if we had 3 dimensions in space, if we didn't have any movement, if I couldn't talk, if we were just frozen eternally, then that understanding of me being separate from all these other things would have no meaning. And so that timeline of the first dimension of things animated and moving is what creates that reality. The second dimension, that plane seeing in third dimensions of our world, is that perception. The third dimension is the sensation, the interaction of these forces that we're used to. So what is the fourth dimension in the context that I'm using it? So if you go back to this figure, and there's a lot of videos that show kind of the movement of the small cube interacting and morphing into the outer cube, and everything else kind of moving, and a lot of people consider that movement as part of the fourth dimension, but I would argue that every dimension has movement, or seemingly so. But how I interpret the fourth dimension is it's kind of a non-local, I guess the other direction. So we have height, length, and width in that cube, in that shape. And when you think about 3D, our world we aren't a little person swimming in a cube, like as this container. Our reality, depending on the shape of the universe, you could say it's almost infinite, or maybe there is a shape, but I'm doubting it looks like that. And so when it comes to the fourth dimension, how that relates to us is it adds that fourth dimension that we're not used to. And so what I would call the inner world, or depth, complexity, those fields within fields that we live in. And so we have this 3D reality, but there's other fields that we interact with that maybe don't, that correlate or coincide with our reality, but are separate from. And so in a sense, it's kind of the idea of having a brain, a 3D physical representation of a brain. But then on the flip side, you have the mind, which is really non-spatial, and it kind of just goes wherever it wants. It has a relationship with the brain, and so when you die, that aspect of your mind goes away. But in a sense, you can talk about psychic powers, or awareness outside of yourself, transpersonal type of things, where knowing the inner essence of another being or object, or being able to see intuitively what's on the other side of things, or I mean, we get into this whole world of psychic abilities, but essentially the fourth dimension would be the internal version of the external world, if you will. And in a sense, from a non-dual perspective, it's all external. But in another way, when we're growing and changing in a spatial 3D sense, we're also developing internally. It's not something that we can see. And it's kind of like, if you think about it as different waves of radiation from the sun that pass through our reality, we don't really necessarily directly know and interact with it. And it's kind of like at a different wavelength. And so it's almost like, when it comes to the fourth dimension, is the outside intertwining with the inside and kind of enfolding in and on self. And so the growth of the change is happening in a direction that we don't necessarily see in the 3D world, but it's still relevant and it's still connected. And so how this relates to non-duality is, I think when people talk about the fourth dimension, or the 10th dimension, or the 42nd dimension, and they do all this math, it comes from a very left brain kind of a mentality that kind of segments off the theory or the math from the rest of the meaning of reality. And so combining the two really makes a lot more sense, because, like I said, to me, the ping pong ball passing through the video game flat screen is a cool thing to think about, but it really doesn't have any relevance to our current reality. And so that is a way that illustrates how our mind works on a day-to-day basis from moment to moment. So whether or not there's all sorts of other realities or other dimensions that we're not aware of or don't interact with, if we don't really have a connection with them, it really loses its meaning to us. And so whether those are real, or the idea that there's a two-dimensional character interacting with our three-dimensional world, or fourth-dimensional being interacting with our three-dimensional world, really at the end of the day doesn't have a lot of meaning to what we're trying to understand here from a human perspective. So coming from the idea of non-duality, the mind always wants to separate things into little boxes, or disconnect things when it comes to understanding the world. And so if you understand it from the way that everything is connected from the beginning, then it makes a little more sense when you start talking about these high-level theory type things. So hoping some of this made sense or clicked. If not, or if it did, let me know in the comments below, and if you have any questions. So until next time, peace. It's been real and also unreal.